Good morning. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. We're a nonpartisan think tank, a 501c3 based in Philadelphia. This morning we've got a program. We've got one of our scholars, Ben Katzeff Silberstein, who's going to be talking about the North Korean response to COVID-19, a topic that hasn't been fully covered in many places, so I think it'll be quite interesting. First of all, before we get started, I'd like to thank our members for their support and our donors for their support to our organization. Without you, we couldn't bring these kinds of programs. And also ask those of you who are new to us to consider joining and donating to our organization. Couple of housekeeping matters. At the bottom of your screen, you will see a chat button. If you would like to ask a question, put your question in the chat box, click on that chat, and a screen will come up on the right hand of your screen, and you can put a question in there. I encourage you to put the questions in as you go along, and then that will enable us to, partway through the program, break into question and answer. I'd like to introduce Jacques Delisle, who's going to be moderating this event this morning. He's the director of FPRI's Asia program. He's also the Stephen A. Cousin Professor of Law and Political Science at University of Pennsylvania, as well as the director of Penn's Center for the Study of Contemporary China. Jacques' most recent book is To Get Rich is Glorious, Challenges Facing China's Economic Reform and Opening at 40. He co-edited that book with Avery Goldstein. His next book, Taiwan Under Tsai, is co-edited with June Teufel-Dreyer. It's forthcoming in 2020, and June is also one of our senior fellows. Jacques is regularly an expert witness on issues related to the PRC, Hong Kong, and Taiwan law and government policies. He's a member of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations and vice chair of the Pacific Rim section of the American Society of International Law. He received his JD and graduate education in political science at Harvard. And for those of you who know FPRI well, Jacques is no stranger to you. Jacques, take it away.
Well, thank you, Raleigh, and thank you everyone for joining us for the latest installment in our Asia programming. As Raleigh said, we're delighted to have with us today Ben Silberstein, who's an old friend and affiliate of FPRI. He's an associate scholar here at FPRI. He's an expert on the Korean Peninsula and East Asian issues, and one of the few people who knows much about North Korea. So we're delighted to have him with us today. He is the editor of North Korean Economy Watch. You can find his work in a number of places, including Jane's Intelligence Review, The Diplomat. He's also published in World Politics Review, East Asia Forum, The Hill, Orbis. You'll see him regularly in various FPRI outlets in addition to Orbis, in eNotes and Geopoliticus and things of that ilk. You can find his two most recent pieces that are quite germane to today's discussion. One, Assessing North Korea's COVID-19 Containment and Kim Jong-un's Political Challenges, and another, What North Korea's Coronavirus Measures Say About Its System. And if you're interested in the coronavirus issues, particularly in East Asia, there's lots of stuff on the FPRI website about North Korea and other places. So without further ado, let me welcome Ben. Thank you for joining us today. And we've got a lot to talk about here. I guess we should just start with the question of North Korea and what to make of the COVID virus in North Korea. Last time I checked, there were officially 0 cases in North Korea, which reminds me of way back in the days of SARS. I was in Shanghai, and consulate staffer said they knew of 3 Americans with SARS in Shanghai when the government was reporting 2 cases in the entire city. What were the odds that 3 of the 2 cases were Americans? So it sounds a little bit similar. So what's going on in North Korea? I mean, this is a famously opaque and secretive place. What do we know about the actual situation? How bad is it? What do we know? What don't we know?
So first of all, thank you very much for having me on today. And I'm very glad to see there's so much interest in this, in COVID-19 in North Korea specifically. So I think with North Korea, obviously it's important to divide between what do we know and what do we believe. We know that the government has quarantined tens of thousands of people, which, you might wonder why a measure like that would be taken if there are absolutely no cases. They've set up quarantine facilities around the country, and they've essentially closed the border, definitely to all foreign travel, but also to most foreign trade. Now, a lot of people believe, for very good reasons, that some coronavirus-related deaths must have occurred in North Korea. There are news reports from through South Korean online news outlets run by people with contacts inside North Korea that testify to sort of clusters of people in certain cities dying from symptoms very similar to COVID-19. Now, the thing is, we can't know because North Korea does not test people in general. We also know that there have been an uptick of COVID-19 cases in provinces in China that border North Korea, and that is of course quite a worrying sign. So, but yeah, there's very little that we know for a fact. Oh.
I forgot to unmute myself. Sorry about that. So if you go into a little bit more about that, how does somebody, broadening the frame a little bit, but how do we figure out what we know and don't know about North Korea? I mean, as you say, there's some things you can get by kind of extrapolating, right? If it's going on in Dongbei in Northeast China, that tells you something. We can get presumably some degree of intel reports that you can sort of piece together. But as a North Korea watcher, how do you piece this kind of information together? Certainly with respect to COVID, but it's also an issue with the other things you cover. Sort of a roadmap to how you do this kind of work?
Well, so I mean, I think most of it is just about exercising a lot of cautious skepticism, but finding and figuring out what sources tend to be reliable. And I mean, there's one outlet in particular that I want to mention named Daily NK, which is run by several people who run it. It's a South Korean news outlet in focusing on North Korea, and a lot of their staff is from North Korea originally, and they have contacts inside North Korea that they communicate with through cell phones smuggled in from China into North Korea. So, and they just tend to be very good with fact checking. And if you follow an outlet like that for several years, you kind of learn more about their track record. And the other thing is, this is very sort of, might sound blunt, but if you have one report claiming to be from inside North Korea that someone died of symptoms similar to COVID-19, then you might not have reason to make that much of it. If you, on the other hand, have 20 or 30 or 50 reports like that, then you got to start to wonder, is there something to this? Is there a broader trend here? So I think those are just some very brief points on that, but it is difficult.
So, the number's not zero, but we don't know how high it is. And if you look at North Korea, which is obviously a very distinctive place, it seems in some respects like it would be a system that's pretty well set up to contain and manage COVID. There's not a whole lot of international travel in and out. Indeed, the sanctions are supposed to keep that down to practically nil. There's some across the Chinese border, but not a ton. It's a pervasive authoritarian state, right? It monitors people, it can lock them down. There are lots of features that would seem to put them in a good position to handle this. I mean, South Korea obviously handled COVID-19 quite well, although with a radically different system. So what are the strengths of the North Korean system for trying to deal with an outbreak like this? And are those strengths, as far as you can tell, being brought to bear effectively?
I think they are, in fact. And I think there's also reason to, in addition to everything you mentioned, I think there's reason to ask, is it possible that North Korea, as a sort of close, the term ally is maybe too strong, but a friend of China, that North Korea was warned earlier than other countries about the outbreak of COVID-19 and that they should take caution. I think that's definitely plausible. So in this case, the strongest features, or the most helpful features, perhaps North Korea's ability to just, like you said, shut the border when they need to, which they have and which they did. And North Korea actually does not have a lot of foreign trade to begin with, which is not great in normal times, because and the Kim Jong-un's regime especially has been wanting to expand foreign trade. It hasn't gone all that well. But in any case, in a way, because North Korea's economy is in such dire straits already, the opportunity, the sort of the cost of shutting down trade is actually, it might be comparatively lower to what it might have been for other countries. There's also very solid, relatively solid control of people's movement inside the country already. I expand on this more in the piece on the FPRI website, but North Korea has one of the most tightly functioning systems for control of, like there's no freedom of movement inside North Korea, practically speaking. Everyone who wants to travel from one province to another needs to have a permit issued by a neighborhood administrator, and this is all quite complicated. So a lot, and leaving North Korea without permission is a crime punishable by death, according to North Korean law. So there are these systems in place already that in normal times have been loosened up somewhat. Like there's a lot of smuggling across the border from China, a lot of trade under the radar and things like that, a lot of movement of people as well. But when the regime needs to, it can tighten the screws on a lot of this. And that's a very important capacity in a time like this, that if you really need to tighten up on controlling who's going in and out, the government can absolutely do so. And they have, from what we know.
So as you say, much of the traffic in and out of North Korea is across the Chinese border, which is officially pretty hard to cross. But in ordinary times, there's a fair amount of traffic back and forth, some of it illicit. Do we have evidence that the spigot's really been turned off on that there is a significant reduction in people moving one way or the other across the border?
Yeah, very significant from what we know. So when it comes to people, I mean, it's much harder to tell than with goods, because goods are much more visible in a way. But I mean, officially, there's I believe North Korea's banned all foreign travel into the country. In general, people obviously aren't so keen on crossing borders anyway these days. So, and when it comes to, I mean, so North Korean exports to China have been dropping very, very steadily under sanctions. And I mean, now with COVID-19, it's just at a very, very low level. And I think there's less reason to suspect that kind of data is doctored as much as, I mean, sanctions give a political rationale to sort of fiddle around with the data to make it look like China's complying more with UN sanctions than they might be in reality. But when it comes to COVID, there's no such political pressure from any outside actors necessarily. So to actually answer your question, we don't really know how much how tightly controlled things are and how little is moving across the border. But I mean, from what I've also, I've heard from people who have insight into these things, that containers full of goods, and not least of humanitarian, I mean, things like medication and fertilizer for the planting season in North Korean agriculture, like a lot of that is sitting and waiting in Chinese ports because both North Korea and China require such rigorous border inspections of goods now, and disinfecting and things like that, which we've seen in North Korean newspapers. They've shown pictures of disinfecting train cars and containers and stuff like that. So things are moving, but it just takes a lot longer than it usually does. And in normal times too, it takes a very long time.
So you noted earlier that because of the relatively close relationship between North Korea and China, I mean, North Korea really doesn't have any other country it's remotely that close to, that there was a possibility that they got somewhat earlier warning. Beyond that, do we have any indication that China's been providing assistance to North Korea in ways that would help cope with COVID if it exists there, which of course is further clue that it does exist? China has done a great deal to try to portray itself globally as providing assistance to hard-hit countries. Do you have any sense that they've been doing that with North Korea?
So for what I can recall now, there's certainly been offers of that, very open offers, but I believe they've also pledged some testing kits and things like that. I'd be very surprised if North Korea were to sort of turn around and start really trying to keep track of how many cases they have and try to be more open about the situation. I have no doubt that China would offer to help, and North Korea would quite likely accept that help because they have very little choice. So yes, the China channel and the ties with China would be extremely important in that kind of situation. But I mean, as of now, again, North Korea keeps maintaining that they have had 0 cases, not even 0 deaths. Other countries have claimed 0 deaths, but North Korea is saying like 0 infections, which is quite remarkable.
So you've gotten in your last comments there a bit into the other side of the story, which is, although North Korea has a number of features that would seem to make it well equipped to try to contain the kind of human contact and flows, it's also got a lot of weaknesses such that if we do get COVID outbreaks, and we do actually have COVID outbreaks, it could be kind of a big problem. So what are the features of North Korea that make it especially vulnerable to being hit hard if COVID does or if COVID has spread?
Yeah, so I actually want to begin answering that question by sort of touching upon what could seem as a strength in a way, like the fact that because North Korea is such a rigorous dictatorship, the regime should be shielded from political pressure, and you shouldn't see and you won't see protests like you've had in the States of people protesting against anti-COVID measures and things like that. At the same time, it's not a government that's entirely immune to domestic pressure, and I think if the government were to start doing things like shutting down marketplaces in order to contain the virus, I think that could prove very problematic it's something that the regime would want to avoid unless they had absolutely no other choice. But when it comes to the vulnerabilities, I mean, I think just the stuff that you would expect pretty much. First of all, it's a very weak medical system. It's a good theoretical structure. Like North Korea has quite a few clinical buildings. They have a large number of doctors that are trained to deal with maybe not the most difficult medical cases, but they can treat most of what most patients would need on sort of nothing too complicated, but still quite competent. The thing is, there's virtually no equipment that would be truly useful in this situation. To my knowledge, North Korea, I mean, they probably have a handful of ventilators. I wouldn't imagine that they have more than enough to sort of provide the very top elite. There's the last number I saw was that there have been 12,000 test kits pledged by donors. It's not a whole lot of test kits, and they're very likely to be restricted to quite a small number of people. And then, I mean, the second thing is there are still, even though North Korea has quite low levels of foreign trade, there are high costs to closing off the economy. There are sectors that are dependent on exports to China. Textiles and minerals are two of those goods. North Korea doesn't have the resources to send stimulus checks to the entire population, to put it very mildly. Of course, there are a lot more resources than, I mean, it's not as a very prominent scholar in the field once put it, North Korea it's a rich regime, but a poor country. So there are resources that could be spent differently, but so part of it is by political choice. But yeah, so it's if there were to be a significant outbreak, I don't know what North Korea could do besides quarantine and contain people. I don't know that they could provide any sort of any level of treatment to people in the country.
Of course, one of the frustrating things about this disease is that there are limits to what treatments seem to do at this point. So it mitigates.
Right. No, for sure.
Not having ventilators and not having oxygen and all of that is
yeah.
huge.
Yeah.
In terms of mitigating. So we know that the official line is 0 cases, but beyond beyond that, how has the regime portrayed the COVID threat, portrayed its ability to cope with it if it comes up, portrayed what's going on in the country? So this is obviously a system where the media available to people in North Korea is pretty much state controlled. And so what do we know about the picture that they've been presenting to their own population about this global pandemic and its possible impact at home?
Yeah, so the North Korean information environment is very complicated to begin with, because we don't, so there are the publications that are available inside North Korea. It's very hard to know to the extent to which the North Korean public actually has access to whatever media we think they have access to, such as the state newspaper Rodong Shinmun, other sources like that. But I mean, the basic line has been that of, at least to the outside world, sort of touting their own system as highly successful in coping with a problem that is ravaging the entire world right now. While the rest of the world is in panic, all is well in Pyongyang and the rest of the country as well. And there's even been sort of a spin on the South Korea situation, which most of us, like you mentioned at the beginning, most of the world has seen South Korea as a positive example of how to do this the right way. I believe in North Korean media they sort of portrayed this sort of recent resurgence in South Korea as sort of like at the very least they reported about this resurgence from a single super spreader inside South Korea as an example of how poorly the neighbor in the capitalist neighbor in the south is doing. So
the message is, see, you should be lucky. You should be glad you don't have nightclubs. Should be the message for that.
Exactly. Yes. No, if people were out at bars, imagine what would. I mean, they yeah. It's, I guess chaos versus stability is, maybe it's an effective narrative. I'm not sure, but I think it's the one they're going with.
So you've touched upon this a little bit in your earlier remarks. I know one of your areas of focus is the North Korean economy. So Kim, the current Kim Jong-un, has really emphasized material betterment, improving the economy. What is this doing to that agenda? Most places, COVID has not exactly been great for the economy. What is this the consequences of what's happening not only possibly in North Korea, which we can't know too much about, but the global shutdown, China's retrenchment, all that. Is this a big set of problems for Kim's economic agenda? And if it is, what does it mean, if anything, for him politically?
Yeah, I mean, there's been quite a significant shift over just the past year or two or so of the way that in sort of both Kim Jong-un himself in speeches, but the sort of regime media in general has been talking a lot more about autarky and the need for people to sort of hunker down and get through a difficult time ahead, which is undoubtedly true. But seen in a bigger picture and sort of taking a step back and looking at what just a few years ago, when Kim Jong-un came to power, the first signs that people when people both in the outside world and I'm sure inside North Korea as well, were trying to parse what kind of leaders does Kim Jong-un want to be. A lot of it evolved around legitimacy from economic growth. Like that was a major theme in his first ever speech as leader of North Korea. He talked about the people never having to tighten their belts again, which is very significant in a country coming out of, where malnutrition is still chronic, and it wasn't that long since North Korea came out of a devastating famine. So, and this is also the context where you have to see things like the amusement park and the ski resort that was constructed on Kim's orders, and all these massive renovations of entire cities, entire blocks in Pyongyang. This, even for the rest of the country, this is a message that even though not everyone can go to the Mashingyong ski resort, very few people are going there, as far as we know, but even though not the whole country can go, it was still meant to show as a show of promise that you will also have this one day if we keep moving in sync, and you keep working for the good of the country and things like that. And it's also the North Korean economy and the overall living standards do seem to have improved under Kim Jong-un, not thanks to him necessarily, but more because the state has stayed away from attacking the market system to a greater extent than, under Kim Jong-il, they were still trying to shut down major markets. Nothing like that has happened under Kim Jong-un. So to have something like this happen after years of, I don't want to say promises, but at least portrayals of trying to give hope to the country that that there is a brighter future, and that this brighter future is intimately tied in with Kim Jong-un as a leader. To have this combined now with sanctions, and this is a very radical shift from this line a few years ago of telling people that things are going to get better and showing people that they are getting better, and now the line is instead things are actually most likely getting worse. So there's, of course, there's the question of, does a dictatorship like North Korea actually have a vested interest in having the population be permanently living in some level of poverty? So, but that's sort of a different discussion. So yeah, really what Kim Jong-un has to offer for the general public right now is very little other than harsh struggle, and that's not a very appealing vision.
Indeed. So you touched upon in your last answer the sanctions and what that has done to North Korea. Of course, if we think back to what seems like a lifetime ago before COVID hit, the story for the last couple of years had been a ratcheting up of sanctions, sort of China becoming, at least for a time, a bit more cooperative, the maximum pressure campaign from the Trump administration, that the sanctions, which had been on the books for a long time, at least for a period of time, seem to be biting a bit more. What's your sense of the impact of sanctions now? Is COVID making them worse because of the more general effect on trade? Is this a case for relaxing sanctions if it looks like North Korea is in really, really hard times because of the economic consequences plus perhaps COVID?
Yeah, I mean, so it's been said before that COVID-19 has essentially done what sanctions never could, which is to actually shut the border to North Korea. I suppose shutting the border entirely was never the intention of sanctions, but anyway, I mean, the big difference really is with only in a scenario where you only have sanctions and not a border closure due to COVID-19, then very, very likely, and this is, I mean, it's most likely already happened. There's some data to suggest that trade with China has been starting to import more and more of sanctioned goods, again, from North Korea under the radar. It's quite likely that a lot more of that would have happened gradually had it not been for COVID. Because the sanctions regime really depended on, I mean, it's always depended on Chinese enforcement. That's always been the big issue. The UN could levy as many sanctions on North Korea as they want, but if China interprets these sanctions in a different way than they're intended, then they don't necessarily matter all that much. They still matter, but not quite so much. So, but now you have, I mean, at least, so they're letting up on it a little bit, but both China and North Korea at the same time having a vested interest in keeping the border closed. Like that's, so in a sense, in that scenario, it doesn't really matter how much China wants to disregard the UN sanctions and begin importing things that from North Korea that they shouldn't be importing according to sanctions. So, so they've really, I mean, the COVID measures have really cemented the economic isolation that the sanctions were intended to create. I think North Korea would like to see the sanctions being let up on a little bit to improve, to alleviate the situation. I don't know that there is a direct connection with COVID-19 because it'd be hard to at the same time claim that we have no cases and everything is fine, but you should still be humane and let up on sanctions. So at the same time, there's one last thing I want to mention on that is it's that the fact that their global attention it's not really on North Korea anymore. I mean, it probably will be over the coming few days because they're trying to make more and more noise now around the leaflets from South Korea. But the more global attention shifts away from North Korea, the more likely it is that China and possibly Russia as well would start to let up on their implementation of sanctions. So that might play into North Korea's favor, but for now, things aren't looking so good.
And of course, the current sorry state of U.S.-China relations.
There's that.
China a little less cooperative on things that are the U.S. agendas. But let's probe that bit a little more. So have we seen any notable changes, or what notable changes we've seen in North Korea's foreign policy in recent moments? Obviously, the Kim-Trump love affair seems to blow hot and cold occasionally. And the related, as just mentioned, the relationship with South Korea seems to just have taken a turn for the worse with the allegations of possibly sending in COVID as well as leaflets and other sort of conspiracy theory type things. So we're used to hearing somewhat odd things coming out of the regime, but what lessons should we take away from what seems to be a somewhat more uncooperative or so more confrontational, indeed some ways kind of out there set of responses, particularly to South Korea, but also if you comment on the U.S. relationship.
You mean just over the past few days or more?
Well, I mean, obviously there's been an uptick in the past few days. So I guess two questions. One, the narrow one, how seriously should we take this balloons and pamphlets type thing. Is that just one of these periodic blips, or does it signify some broader turn? And then then beyond that, what's your general sense of the trend in North Korea's foreign policy and external behavior?
Yeah.
Let's take the narrow question first.
Yeah. So I think it's mostly a blip. I mean, it's not. I don't know if blip is the right word, because this has been always. I mean, North Korea has, so this most recent spat of like rhetoric against South Korea really stems from a very deep sense that anger and irritation that South Korea isn't doing more to go against to get rid of the sanctions and to get trade going with North Korea, and to possibly some forms of donations as well. But I mean, that's really what in a way, North Korea is. So the South Korean government is kind of stuck in I'm not sure if the middle is the right word, but they're still very, very keen on more so-called engagement with North Korea. At the same time, as I mean, that's completely dead. And for now, the alliance with America is far more important than any kind of engagement with North Korea. So from North Korea's point of view, it's very hard to see what else they could do right now. They think that they deserve to have South Korea work harder in their favor. You could already say that the South Korean government is doing quite a lot of things in order to please North Korea, with really being quite a lot more forceful than they have in the past against these launches of leaflets by NGOs that want to send information into North Korea. I mean, essentially, you now have the South Korean government, I don't want to say doing the North Korean government's bidding, because that's quite harsh, but really going against its own civil society in the interest of the North Korean regime. So, I mean, foreign policy-wise, it just seems quite bleak. I just cannot imagine again, when the whole world, and most importantly, the US, is completely focused on other things, and North Korea is quite likely very worried about what might happen if Donald Trump loses the election, because then he's been their most important asset in a very, very long time. The biggest chance they've had at any sort of progress with the international community in perhaps since the Korean War. So yeah, it's they're in a very, very tight spot. So again, I have a hard time seeing what else within the North Korean playbook they could really be doing right now, other than making the type of noise that they're making. So it's probably going to increase over the coming few days. And it wasn't in sort of the global spotlight for that long, but there was a shot fired from the North Korean side on a South Korean guard post along the demilitarized zone. That might also have been an attempt to ratchet up something like this in order to just put the issue of sanctions relief and cooperation projects with South Korea on the table again.
So you mentioned the prospect that Trump doesn't get reelected and therefore Biden would get elected. What's your sense of the impact that would have, or of what North Korea expects would happen? Is this a return just to sort of the pre-Trump way of approaching things? Because, as you know, one of the things that Trump made a great deal of hay out of on this was how little progress had been made. In many ways, a fair criticism, how little progress had been made through 5-party talks, 6-party talks, that whole approach for many years.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I don't think it's necessarily a priority for a potential President Biden. It seems that part of the reason that Donald Trump has made this such a priority is that it is a great show. I mean, these summits have made for, there are very dramatic things happening. I cannot imagine a President Biden doing what Trump did and just agreeing to meet Kim Jong-un in that kind of setting. And yeah, I mean, that is probably what Pyongyang is the most worried about, is that it would just be going back to the way that things were before this, what I think in the history books will look like a very bizarre period of diplomacy, or not, or it will be the end to the conflict on the Korean Peninsula. Quite unlikely, but so yeah, I think there's a fear that the U.S. will go back to this. I mean, the kind of position that has just been very thing is, North Korea is not a country that there are very few politically good choices when it comes to dealing with North Korea. There's a reason that it was one of the issues that former President Obama, I believe, mentioned in a letter to Trump or something of that sort, that or to his whoever the predecessor was going to be, that North Korea is an issue that he was deeply worried about, and where he just didn't really see a clear way forward, and that's probably what things would revert to, I suspect. On the other hand, you have a process going, and it might be that it's hard to maybe I'm really not an expert on the U.S. foreign policy under a theoretical President Biden, but one could imagine that it's harder to say to stop a potential peace process than it is to start one, perhaps. I'm not sure.
Oh, if you try, you can.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the other kind of election that tends to matter for North Korea's relations is South Korean elections. We're still a couple of years away from the next South Korean presidential election, but South Korea's policy toward North Korea has tended to swing back and forth a bit with different presidents. Of course, the 1 5-year term structure and often alternating parties in power. Way too early to be predicting the 2022 South Korea election, probably. But how much does that factor into the way North Korea approaches these things? How much do you think a current South Korean president can lock things in and bind a predecessor? What's the impact of sort of South Korean incumbent on the prospects for dealing relatively cooperatively or effectively with North Korea?
Yeah, as long as you don't have any progress with on sort of the global stage when it comes to North Korea, it's very hard to see that the current administration could lock anything in, really. I mean, in the past, you've had such large-scale projects like the Kaesong Industrial Complex and things like that you can't even a conservative government couldn't necessarily come in and say that we're going to shut that entire thing down and just leave all those companies to hang them out to dry. It's such a non-starter right now. Any sort of letting up on sanctions. Although the South Korean government, I mean, they keep trying to push the boundaries quite a lot on this, at least rhetorically, sort of talk about different things that you could do, like railway refurbishments and things like that, which it's very hard to see how anything of that sort doesn't violate sanctions at this point. I mean, medical aid does not violate sanctions, and there's been a few already, I believe, exceptions made for transports of medical shipments to North Korea that would sort of sidestep the normal process that of scrutiny and that sanctions impose. But no, it's hard to tell when the general public would eventually stop seeing this as a positive feature in an election campaign. I mean, generally, this President Moon, North Korea tends not to be that big of an issue in South Korean politics in general, I should say. It's so it's not something that people talk about all that much in elections. But at the same time, it's been a big feature of Moon's presidency, and I'm sure he would like to lock things in, but as of now, it seems quite unlikely.
I want to give our listeners a chance to weigh in on these various issues as well. But before I turn to that, is there anything that you want to say that we haven't covered yet?
I think there are things happening in the North Korean economy, partially as a result of the COVID situation, that have not been all that much reported about in international media, that I think are quite important too. So I'm going to take this opportunity to tell the 69 people on this call that it seems like there is an increasingly intense campaign from the state demanding more money from the people and from economic actors right now. Things like so-called loyalty payments for the party. If it's that's a nice semi-private business you've got there. It'd be a shame if we had to confiscate it. Extortionary taxes on private business and things like that. So there's sort of there are a lot of signs suggesting that the government is running low on especially foreign currency, and whatever happens after this is all over, if it does end in a definite way, for North Korea, is going to be a very long road to recovery. So that's the last thing I want to add.
Okay, on that happy note, we'll turn.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, all sunshine.
So, yeah, sunshine and puppies, rainbows and unicorns. The so some of these questions tack back to some of the issues we were discussing. So I'll take them in no particular order, but it's something we discussed recently. The matter of elections elsewhere. Obviously, no elections in North Korea that matter. But one of our listeners asks whether it's possible that North Korea will try to intervene in the U.S. elections through various cyber means and such. I mean, obviously, Russia has been the main source that we know of that. There have been rumblings about China, and we know North Korea has done some cyber hacking, and Sony Pictures and others. Do you see those two strands coming together? Do you see them trying to do anything that would be in any way disruptive to our either elections narrowly defined or our political process heading into the elections?
It's quite possible that they would try. I'm really not sure about their capacity to do any meaningful damage to the elections per se. It's quite likely that they would try to intervene by other means of sort of testing a missile of some sort or what have you, to bring political focus to North Korea and perhaps try to get concessions from, especially from President Trump. But I'm really not sure, but again, trying. I mean, it's if they don't, it won't be for the lack of wanting to, for sure.
So, related to the point about sort of dealing with the U.S. here, you mentioned also this question of possible sanctions relief because of the dire state of the North Korean economy. Now, of course, the main way around the bite of sanctions has been China not enforcing them terribly tightly, Russia to some degree, but really largely China. Do you see any hope for more formal, more open above board reduction of sanctions? I mean, we talked about the possibility of some kind of catastrophe within North Korea. COVID gets completely out of control and they admit it or something. But do you see any sort of that? Do you see a negotiated reduction of sanctions unless North Korea is willing to make big concessions that it has not been making on its nuclear program?
Well, you could imagine North Korea making concessions that look significant, but that might not be in reality, like dismantling facilities that weren't being used anyway, and so on. I mean, that would serve a political purpose for both North Korea and for President Trump, because President Trump could show that something has happened here, and this is North Korea is doing what we're telling him to do, which is essentially what's been happening already during the process. But in reality, it's difficult to overestimate how important the nuclear weapons are for the North Korean government, both as a tool as a means for propaganda domestically and as a show of force, really. So if we're talking about, I mean, this whole idea of denuclearization is extremely unlikely to happen from the beginning, and I don't see that anything has changed there. At the same time, implementation of sanctions was already kind of starting to erode. It was eroding as quickly or as drastically as some people were saying, because it's not a binary thing. Like, it's not a binary process where either you have full sanctions implementation or you have nothing. So as soon as things begin to break a little bit, as soon as North Korea is able to, I don't know, import more oil than they should, or export more of minerals than they should be doing, there is a tendency, and I see it as being largely for political reasons among some people, to say, okay, look, now it's all broken down. Sanctions don't work; they're meaningless because China isn't doing anything anyway. Even if sanctions aren't implemented perfectly, they're still doing a lot of damage to the North Korean economy, because everything gets more expensive. If you want to buy more oil, the most efficient way is not having two ships docking out on the ocean and then doing this like at night in secrecy. That's not very it's not very cost effective, and North Korea is quite likely paying a lot more money for those kinds of shipments than they otherwise would, and also conversely quite likely getting less than they otherwise would for whatever they're able to export under the radar. So it's not necessarily that as soon as China starts to let up on things that things are back to normal. That's really not the case. So in that sense, I suppose one could say that if your goal is to have sanctions be tight, then political pressure on China quite likely works. But again, as you pointed out, very justly, the relations between the US and China being what they are right now, it's quite unlikely that, and North Korea is not even on, at one point it was maybe number 2 on the list, but now I don't even know where we would place it in terms of priority.
In terms of US-China relations?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, trade has jumped that. COVID has jumped everything. Taiwan is back in the mix. Hong Kong.
Right.
Under a different administration, you might see more on the Uyghurs. I mean, it's such a rich menu to choose from.
Could we say a strong 9?
Definitely top 10. Don't worry. You haven't
Okay.
And Kim has it in his power to make it number 1 again if he chooses to.
That's for sure. Wow, number 1 even. That's
well, I mean, if you get a genuine nuclear crisis going, you could probably get it back up to the top of the list.
50 Days of Fame, perhaps.
Yeah, that would probably 50. Yes, Andy Warhol expanded but anyway, so let me just follow up on that strand. So for those of us who are kind of China watchers, the story has always been that you can find this sort of strange mix of aligned and highly unaligned interests between the U.S. and China over the North Korea problem, right? So everybody wants a peaceful and stable North Korean, so everybody wants a peaceful and stable Korean Peninsula. The problem is the two sides have different worst case scenarios, right? The Chinese bad case scenario is a disorderly collapse of North Korea and inrush South Korea and the Americans. The U.S. bad scenario is nuclear proliferation and things like that. How does North Korea see that U.S.-China relationship? How does it try to steer around that? Is there this kind of we see brinksmanship toward the United States, right? We're going to ratchet up the nukes unless you cooperate. Do you think they play China the same way? I mean, I talk to Chinese foreign policy people. They often don't seem to think they can read Kim all that well, but they do seem to take the point that Kim kind of has them over a barrel, because if they don't bail them out to some degree, it turns into a very bad situation for China, right? North Korea collapses, refugees come across the border, Seoul winds up governing the whole peninsula. Absent American withdrawal, you've then got American forces on your border, potentially, all that bad stuff. Does North Korea read that game the same way, as far as you can tell?
In terms of pushing China through various measures.
In terms of the sense that they have leverage on China, because if China ultimately doesn't back them, at least to some degree, China's got a big problem.
I think so, and it's my impression, and this is really your area of expertise. My impression from Chinese, both scholars and people who talk and write about these things, is that North Korea, most people perceive North Korea as quite annoying. Like that's
they do, yeah.
And so to the extent that that's the case, then sort of North Korea does have leverage to increase that level of annoyance in a way, quite a lot of it. I mean, we saw, I'm trying to remember how many times in one single year that Kim Jong-un met with Xi Jinping when all this was happening. Quite a few times, which is it's a very impressive accomplishment in a way. By a country like North Korea to do that, to like be one of the second largest economy in the world, I guess in terms of leverage, I'm not sure how far it goes, but it's in a way, if you look at what China is doing it often does for North Korea, just like building infrastructure for free, essentially, on the border, in order to, it's both things like that are both measures to stimulate border provinces to North Korea and China, but it's also, it's for sure a way of helping North Korea. And I think there's a sense in sort of North Korean foreign policy toward China that we deserve this. China should be helping us because we're doing what they really should be doing and truly challenging the United States on the world stage, which, arguably China is doing more of that as well.
And there is also the reading of the Kim-Xi meetings that this was Xi's sort of preventing too much of a drift toward Trump when that relationship.
Right. I wonder about that because in theory, it makes a lot of sense. And I know that one of your colleagues and one of my former teachers when I was taking classes at Penn, Arthur Waldron, has argued that United States should have tried harder to lure North Korea away from China as they sort of bring North Korea as an ally. I always found that to be theoretically very, valid point, but in practice, just seems extremely unlikely given that China, I mean, if you look at sort of connections on the ground, there is no other country that has such channels into North Korea as China does. It's just completely unparalleled.
I agree. I think it was mostly posturing and reassurance. I don't think there was a genuine fear that was going to happen. You're meeting with Trump, come meet with me too, because who's your daddy, basically. I think
right, to sort of show that we're coordinating this because it's not something that North Korea can go out alone, I suppose, is one way of seeing it.
Right. So we have a couple of economics-related questions I want to pose to you. One is sort of a big picture question here, that we always talk about sanctions on North Korea and relaxing sanctions and all that. Is this purely an elite strategy? I mean, the question basically says, look, aren't people already just economically pretty miserable, and then you're talking fairly marginal changes? So, the questioner asks sort of, therefore, aren't you really just squeezing, you cannot really meaningfully squeezing regular people? Is it just targeting elite? And I guess the other question one can ask is that in a situation that dire, is there something problematic about imposing sanctions on a regime where when things get tight, the elite still does pretty well? You're inflicting a humanitarian catastrophe on a place that's already a humanitarian catastrophe.
Yeah, that's the thing. So sanctions never created any humanitarian catastrophe in North Korea. They were, I mean, all the really disastrous, the famine was completely, I mean, it was triggered by outside events, but it was homemade by sort of, because of the way the North Korean economy is set up. The issue of whether sanctions hit the elites or regular people is, I mean, it's very difficult to answer because we really do know quite little about exactly who suffers, what sectors of the economy are the most hurt by sanctions. And I mean, there have been some claims. I know there's an NGO that published a report that said that like North Korean women were being disproportionately harmed by sanctions. I don't know how you get solid enough information to draw conclusions like that. What we can say is that some of these sectors that sanctions target are both they're very important sources of income for the elites. Minerals, textiles, like all of these are, there's sectors where the North Korean elites have very, very strong interests. At the same time, they do employ a large number of people, especially textiles, which is very, very labor intensive. So I'm not sure that it's really not a binary thing as with general with sanctions, that we can't say that they hurt either the elites or the general public. What we can say is that the general public non-elites are not shielded from impacts from sanctions, even though by design, that's how the sanctions are supposed to work. That's just not possible because there are very few sectors in the North Korean economy that are completely siloed and cut off from the rest of the economy. I mean, just even something as simple as, let's say you have tens of thousands of people employed in textile factories. They have, in times when North Korea exports more textiles, they have income to spend, and when sanctions work harder, then they don't. So, or not as much at least. So it's quite tricky and hard to know.
And so, of course, the obverse of that is if you lighten up sanctions, it's some of the benefits of that will go to ordinary people and not all be captured.
Yes,
by the elites.
Quite a bit of it is captured by elites as well. But
yeah, of course, yeah, they get their Courvoisier. So a question that says, many economic experts see the issuance of bonds as a means to tax the populace. They see that as risking upsetting North Korea's populace by selling these bonds in a way similar to the 2009 currency redenomination. Is this a sign of regime desperation? What economic signposts would you look to monitor for signs of growing instability?
So I was reading the chats too. Though I want to say if there's some very, very interesting points made by a lot of very insightful people in the chat. So I would especially recommend that people read what Professor Sandra Fahy is writing Anyway, so signposts to look to monitor signs of growing instability. I mean, I think what Vivian is pointing out, the issuance of bonds, that is, the words like instability tend to come with a lot of baggage in a way. Like it's, but definitely of, and I'm not sure about desperation either, but definitely of a growing need to find new sources for revenue, because like this is not something that the government would ideally want to do. I can't see any reason why the North Korean states would want to. So if I should just, I suppose, just explain briefly that there's been news coming out that North Korea has issued bonds for the first time in quite a while, government bonds, and that there's been a lot of coercion and pressure on various economic actors to buy these bonds, which are, I mean, and they would not do, you wouldn't buy these bonds because you're looking to make a profit. They are, I would not personally invest in them unless I had a gun pointed to my head.
Which is pretty close to what's going on. But
yeah, I mean, so this is definitely, it is a very, very clear sign that the state is under growing pressure to find new sources of revenue, for sure. And that's, you know, there's been, through the whole period of maximum pressure and sanctions and whatnot, like people have been saying, like, okay, we don't see any clear signs that the North Korean economy is suffering, like are sanctions doing anything at all? And I'm not sure that, you know, I'm not sure you can just look at prices of rice and say, oh, they're stable, so therefore sanctions aren't having an impact at all. But things like this, like these kinds of, even though this is anecdotal information from very reliable sources, but still, like, these are very clear points of evidence suggesting that yes, the government is increasingly in increasing need to find new ways of getting money. And this is very, very troubling, because what the North Korean government does when it needs revenue and it can't up exports of minerals and other things to China, then they are going to turn to the people. And the longer and the further this goes, no one will be entirely shielded from this, I don't think.
We're almost up against our time, so I'm going to loop back to one question that's buried fairly far up in the chat that I think is a quick one, and just to get us back to our main original theme here on COVID, which is on the list of weaknesses in North Korea in responding to COVID. The questioner implicitly asks, isn't information control a serious weakness? I mean, that's certainly one of the critiques of what happened in China, right? The quashing of the initial whistleblowers, the government cover-up. Obviously, North Korea has that sort of thing in spades. Do you see that as a real risk of amplifying the possible COVID impact?
Absolutely. I saw that point in the chat, and I wish I would have brought it up myself earlier. I mean, I think there's both. I suppose, are we talking about covering up of information, like deliberate covering up, or of, because I think there are elements of both.
I took it as a more general point about just the lack of flow of information, whether it be cover up or just non-reporting and lack of transparency.
I mean, fear is so built into the way that the North Korean bureaucracy functions that, you know, to be that person in the locality to report that yes, we have cases of what we're quite sure is COVID-19. I mean, no one's going to want to do that, and this is what every tightly controlled dictatorship suffers from. I believe it's Hayek who first, F.A. Hayek, who termed the information problem of referring to prices, but it's equally true for things like harvests. You don't want to be the person to report problematic figures. In the same way, you just don't know what you're risking if you come out with if you're the one to sound the alarm bells on an outbreak of COVID-19 in whatever locality you happen to be a government official in. So yeah, it's a huge problem. It's very, very concerning.
Well, thank you, Ben, for demonstrating the opposite of that. That is a lot of great information freely flowing. We are authoritarian here only in one dimension, that is we do try to end on time. So thank you, Ben, for a terrific talk. Thank you all for joining us, and I'll throw it back to Raleigh to send us out.
Can I say thank you very much to everyone and to all the really terrific questions and comments. I've really enjoyed reading the chat.
Thanks, Ben and Jacques. I thought that was a terrific discussion. And thank you, I agree, terrific chat questions, and appreciate the audience participation as well. And speaking of audience participation, I hope you'll take the opportunity to check out FPRI's website, where this and other videos will be displayed, including a couple weeks ago, we did a terrific series of events. Some of you were there for that, but if you missed them, I strongly recommend them. The authors who wrote in our spring Orbis edition on political warfare in East Asia, fascinating, and all those events are captured on that website. So thank you again, Jacques and Ben. Thank you to our supporters and our future supporters who might be tuning in today. Please come back. Welcome your feedback as well. And to you and all your families, please stay safe and well. Take care.